It's very clear that this situation is not over just yet. Even in downtown Miami, where Calvin and Terrell and Ian are, the police are fanned
Andrew
out.
and Alex, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Calvin.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You know what, if we can just have a brief conversation about something that you all talked about earlier. And Terrell, you are certainly welcome to join in on the conversation as well. But what's interesting is that, everything has sort of shifted to talking about the demonstrators and protesters and what has happened. And I think the goal is not to take the focus off of George Floyd, who died after the officer was pressing his knee into his neck, even after he pleaded for his life and said, look, I cannot breathe. And that's really what this is all about for a lot of people. Now, you always have your outliers who try to turn things into something that it's really not. Some people who may be dreaming of anarchy, some folks who may want to go into stores and take things that don't belong to them. Clearly that has taken place not only here in Miami, but in other places all across the country. But the real focus should be on George Floyd. And also the fact that I've had other journalists who worked here in this market in Miami and Fort Lauderdale back in 1980 who have emailed me and have told me, this reminds me very much of what happened 40 years ago, and nothing has changed. And we heard that from Madam Renita Holmes, who told us very clearly, hurt people hurt people. So folks are hurting, and that's maybe one reason why they set the car on fire, looted the car, vandalized the car, doing things that they're doing now. Is it justifiable? Perhaps not. But anger really is a stage of grief. And there are a lot of people who are grieving about what happened in Minneapolis. So we cannot keep, talking about what has gone wrong. I think what we also have to talk about is folks are coming out here because they're hurting right now and they want to see change. It's been 40 years in Miami since the last riot. And for people like Renita Holmes, nothing has changed at all. And Terrell, you can certainly join in on this conversation as well. As a black male, this is something that, we have to have this conversation. As black men, we have to have a conversation. If you have a child, you don't have any, I have 2 boys. And but your mother probably had to have a conversation with you when you got your driver's license. And you had to figure out when a police officer pulled you over, well, you knew you had to do certain things so that you would not come across as being intimidating.
These are real conversations that are happening in households here in South Florida and all across the country, especially with, minority families. I mean,
Absolutely.
this is a real reality, especially when you're dealing with law enforcement officers. There is a certain amount of sensitivity that comes with it. But especially if you're young and you're black, then you are very aware of those things in a way that people who are not people of color may not be aware of them because they've never had to deal with them in such a way. And as you mentioned, our parents have dealt with those types of things and they tried to hand down that knowledge. Things have gotten better over the 40 years, but it's not where it is. And a lot of those issues,
exactly.
It's not where it should be is what I meant to say. But a lot of those issues is really what is driving so much of the frustration that people are voicing and acting out today.
And it goes back to the saying, hurt people hurt people. So not to dominate the conversation, but I think it's important for us to give that perspective since we uniquely have that perspective as black males that, look, a lot of folks are hurting and they want to see change. And for some who have lived in this community, all you have to do is go on social media, go on Instagram, go on Facebook. You can see other black males who have lived in this city, other police officers who have said, look, I'm hurting and I can relate to what's going on. So again, Alex and Andrew, not to dominate the conversation, but I just wanted to give that unique perspective.
No, and Calvin, I'm glad that you brought that up. I think that is a very important point. Being, like you said, Calvin, you have 2 boys, and passing that message on. Terrell, growing up as a black man, myself being a black female who has a black brother, those conversations that happen in that household about police and how to carry yourself when you do face a certain circumstance or situation, they start at a very young age, and that is very real for our group of people being black in America. That is just a very real, very just raw reality for so many of us. And I think that, like you mentioned there, Calvin, Renita giving that perspective from years ago bringing it on into now, it was very interesting to hear, because one thing, a very powerful moment that we saw today during these protests, when we had that moment of silence and those fists up in the air, really just not moving away from the message and why we are out here today. The police brutality that we know, protesters shouting that they want to see the end to that police brutality, the deaths of Black men, Black women, and children. So there is a larger message here, a very important and powerful message that I think is so important that doesn't get lost in some of the commotion and some of the destruction that we are starting to see now. So Calvin, Terrell, I do thank you so much for that perspective, because I feel as though that was so important to hit on, certainly as we continue navigating the situation tonight.